Everyone, I am Rebecca Kobrin, the Russell and Bettina Knapp Associate Professor of American Jewish History at Columbia University, and I'm welcoming you to this roundtable on teaching anti-Semitism. Thank you everyone for coming today. I know there's so much going on, and I know that we all have fatigue from staring at a screen for a whole semester. So I thank you for coming and joining our discussion today with four wonderful scholars that I'll introduce in a minute in the order that they're going to speak. I am not going to introduce them in between, so they will just go and speak in order. And they are going to speak about, and I will say questions to them about their experiences this past semester teaching about anti-Semitism. So first, we're going to hear from Paola Tartakoff, who is a professor in the departments of History and Jewish Studies and the chair of Jewish Studies at Rutgers, where she teaches courses on anti-Semitism, medieval Europe, Jewish-Christian relations, the Inquisition, and medieval Spain. Her new book, Conversion, Circumcision, and Ritual Murder in Medieval Europe, just came out with Penn Press. And her previous work was Between Christian and Jew, Conversion, and Inquisition in the Crown of Aragon. She will be followed by Michael Brenner, who is the Seymour and Lillian Abinson Chair of Israel Studies and the Director for the Center for Israel Studies at American University. He also holds a chair of Jewish History and Culture at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich and serves as the international president of the Leo Baeck Institute. His latest book is in German, and it's scheduled to appear with Princeton University Press in 2021. It is titled Hitler's Munich, Jews, Anti-Semites, and the Rise of Nazism. And he is the first recipient of the newly established Salo and Jeanette Barone Award for Scholarly Excellence in Research on the Jewish Experience. He will be followed by Professor Pam Nadell, who actually organized this panel and we all roundtable, and we all thank her, who holds the Patrick Clenenden Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she also directs the Jewish Studies program. Her most recent book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the 2019 National Jewish Book Award, Everett Book Prize, which was for the best book, Jewish Book of the Year for last year. And she is also one of the past presidents of the Association for Jewish Studies. And finally, we will hear from Britt, who is a fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She holds a JD and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is currently finishing her first book entitled May It Displease the Court, Jewish Lawyers and the Democratization of American Law, which is about the radical Jewish lawyers in the 19th and 20th century in the United States. So just to begin the conversation, I want to just put forth everyone some ground rules of how we're doing this. I'm going to put forth questions to all the speakers, and then they will speak in the order that I just presented them. And if you have questions, everyone should use the chat to ask the questions, and I will then incorporate your questions. We are ending the session 15 minutes early, so you can use the schmooze and directly ask questions to speakers, but before then, please use the chat. So the roundtable is gonna just open up with a presentation of all of the speakers' syllabi that they used in the past semester. There's in the chat a link to these syllabi, and each speaker is gonna comment on how they structured the course, the assignments, and thinking about this specific moment. Indeed, anti-Semitism is a topic we have all thought, wrote, and spoken about at many times, but rarely has it been as present in the lives of our students as it has been in this past year. So how did each of the teachers and the speakers define anti-Semitism? How did they negotiate the politics underlying the course and the politics of the contemporary moment in which we find ourselves? What guided them when they chose certain teaching materials and what options? And how did their specific academic specialties, they think, structure how they presented this subject of anti-Semitism and engaged with their students? So first we will start with Paola. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. It's a pleasure to be here today and share with you my experience teaching a large lecture course on anti-Semitism at Rutgers University for the first time in spring 2019. So I'm going to do my best to just answer some of those questions that Rebecca just shared, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions during the remainder of the roundtable and learning from my colleagues also who will be presenting their experiences. So I decided to teach a large lecture course, a historical survey on anti-Semitism about 2 years ago in the wake or in the midst of this upsurge in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States and Europe. I'm a medieval historian, and I felt really compelled to broaden my investigation of anti-Semitism, both chronologically and also disciplinarily. And I wanted to do so in dialogue with undergraduates to see if together we could come to some new understandings of ways to negotiate and navigate these contemporary challenges. Nearly 100 students enrolled, and this was an incredibly diverse group, which was part of the great challenge and reward of the experience. I had Muslim students, Hindu students, Christian, Jewish students who were unaffiliated, students whose backgrounds I have no idea what they were. So this was daunting and exciting, and was very much present in my mind from the get-go as I planned the course and saw the enrollments coming in, and also from having taught at Rutgers for a long time, which is an incredibly wonderfully diverse university. I divided my syllabus into 5 sections, 5 units. The 3 core units constitute a chronological survey of anti-Semitic developments starting, and this was very important to me, and I could discuss this later, before the emergence of Christianity, so looking at Hellenistic Egypt and Imperial Rome, then moving on to early Christianity in the Middle Ages, and then the modern period from the emancipation of the Jews through the Holocaust. And then the course opened with Unit 1, current events, definitions, theories of anti-Semitism, and it closed with contemporary challenges, a unit that covered issues such as Holocaust denial, anti-Zionism and its relationship with anti-Semitism, and the relationship between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. There were 3 types of assignments: a weekly response paper, and I have the prompts for these papers on the syllabus, which I've posted. So a weekly response paper answering a question or 2 about an excerpt from a primary source. 5 quizzes, one at the end of each of the 5 units, and a final reflection paper for which students could choose one of 3 prompts to write about. So I smiled when I saw that one of the questions for this roundtable was, how did you define anti-Semitism? Because this is one of the core themes of the way I taught the course. I start the course on day 1, and I'm about to teach it for a second time starting in January. And I plan to do it again this way by asking students, how would you define anti-Semitism? And it immediately becomes clear that there are many ways to do so. In the course, I use the term loosely and in a broad sense to mean anti-Jewish prejudice, but we talk about the history of the specific term. We talk about why it's important to formulate definitions of anti-Semitism, what purposes definitions serve, and we talk about also the great variety of contemporary definitions and why some of them are quite controversial. In the process, we also break down the different components of definitions of anti-Semitism, and I think this is useful for helping students understand how complicated defining the term is. What's the nature of anti-Semitism? Is it an attitude? Is it about conduct? What's its content? What are the objects of anti-Semitism? Are they Jews, people perceived as Jewish, real Jews, an imagined Jew, nations, institutions? What functions does anti-Semitism serve? Should that be in a definition? In what forms is anti-Semitism expressed? And should anti-Semitic stereotypes be listed or given as examples within a definition? And then one of the final reflection paper prompts asks students to create a definition of anti-Semitism and accompany that definition, which can be a few sentences long, with a short essay explaining the thought process that went into each element of that definition, their rationale, and also explaining what they might have deliberately chosen not to include in that definition and why, having thought throughout the course about the potential consequences of certain types of definitions and including and excluding certain types of information. So defining anti-Semitism is something we grapple with from start to finish, both as observers and as actors, students and instructor alike. In terms of politics and negotiating politics of our contemporary moment, and just as they have been central
You have 1 minute.
throughout. 1 minute left. Okay, I'll say I don't like to have elephants in the room, and so we put them on the table for the start, from the start, mentioning things like anti-Zionism, using Holocaust-related terminology in relationship to contemporary events, and why these things are sensitive and complicated. I really prioritize and try to model civil discourse, speaking and listening in ways that promote mutual understanding. I'd be happy to say more about that. And also, even before that, defining our terms, because if we're arguing about a matter, but we have different ideas in mind as to what we're actually arguing about, that's a waste of time. So also understanding the history of terms. And the last thing I'll just mention is that in regards to how my particular academic specialty determined the structure of my course, as a historian, I think in terms of the long evolution of things. And I think this is really crucial to understanding how our culture has developed what David Feldman referred to in a session on Monday as a repertoire of anti-Semitic tropes or themes. And I strive above all to impart to students that anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes have deep roots. These themes emerge in specific historic contexts, often for reasons that say more about non-Jews' fears and anxieties than about Jews, and that they continue to assume new meanings in new contexts. And once we understand this, I think we can achieve distance from those tropes and see reality more clearly for what it is. And we can apply this methodology also to dismantling other forms of racism and bigotry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just before we go, there has been some questions about accessing the syllabi. I have reposted where it is. So if anyone has questions, they can send it to me, but it's been reposted. And I think everyone in this roundtable can now access them. Michael?
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. And thank you, Pam, for putting this session together, and Paola for going first. So I try to be short, and I'll try not to repeat, because many of the things you said, Paola, do also, I think, apply to my classes. So I have actually taught this class for the first time about 20 years ago as a lecture course in Munich. So I'm still teaching now in both, for the last 7 or 8 years in both places, Munich and American University in Washington. I taught it the very first time in DC this semester, which just ended. And the one question which comes to my mind first, which is not on the list, is did I teach it actually differently? I think one of the difference in terms of the student audience is that I have basically hardly any Jewish students in Munich, but I would say half to, depending on the class, half to 2/3 of my classes at AU are Jewish. So do I teach it different? Of course I use different materials. I use German sources in Germany and English sources here and so on. But I actually didn't do it very differently, with the one exception that I teach more about the American experience here and then more about the post-war European experience there, but otherwise not so much. I'll also try to respond to some of the questions, maybe not in the order they were posed. What guided our choices of teaching materials out of the many options? So I already said it depends really a little bit where I teach, but besides, I think besides the literature available, I want to say that, like many of us, we're also influenced by classes we might have taken ourselves. In my case, that's been a while ago, but I must say, I remember it might have been the first lecture class I took at Columbia University with Yosef Yerushalmi. It was a history of anti-Semitism. And I think in a certain way, even though the literature is different we use, but it still guides me as a class, which I still have pretty much present in my memory. So that's, I think, an interesting experience why I actually choose even to teach it, because it was such a great class I took myself. How did our particular academic specialties determine the structure of each course? I just want to say, in my case, as probably with many of you, I enjoy teaching the subjects which are really far away from my special area so much more than in my own area. So actually, I don't teach much, in my case, of German Jewish history or German anti-Semitism in Germany. It's part of the class, especially here in America, but it's a very small part. And I enjoy much more the pre-modern parts and the modern parts, which is actually my area. So in a way, I think my specialty guides me only in a way that I try not to teach too much on it in a lecture class like that. How did we negotiate the politics underlying this course and the politics of our contemporary moment? And that's, I think, that guided me very much. That question is very important to me when I looked at it. I split the class in two main parts. The first part, where I used academic texts and sources. I had them read from David Nuremberg, Jakob Katz, and others. And I went from antiquity, again, as Paola said, starting with the pre-Christian period, basically to the Holocaust. And then in the second part of the semester, I tried something different, where I used a lot of non-academic texts, like essays in journals, in newspapers that came out now or in the last few years. Deborah Lipstadt's latest book, which is not really an academic book, but this kind of exchange of letters. I had them watch movies like Denial. And we also were very lucky that we had a series which Pam and I had organized on campus. One of the discussion series on anti-Semitism, for example, Paola Tartakoff and David Nuremberg and others. So they could also listen to people from outside. So this whole second half of the semester was more discussion based, and it was also more on contemporary questions like where is the border between anti-Israel statements and anti-Semitism? What's the relationship between anti-Semitism and racism in the US? Is there a future for Jews in Europe or not? Is America still the exception or not? So these were some of the questions we discussed. So there was kind of a distinction between first and second half of the semester. What was one topic or assignment that succeeded? Well,
You're getting ahead of yourself. That's the next round.
Oh, that's the next round. Okay.
So Pam, this is a perfect.
I'll just, and just the defining anti-Semitism. I think what was important to me is that in order to understand what they all hear and read about today, that they understood that it really is important to learn about the long history of anti-Semitism. Okay, I'll stop here.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. And I especially really want to thank the participants on the panel today, because when I thought about this seminar or this conversation, it was really a reflection of the fact that when I was developing this course, I've now taught it twice. I taught it this past semester and I taught it last spring. I reached out to every person on this panel and I said, I need help. So thank you so much, because I learned a great deal from from the conversations and everyone's syllabi. So the first thing I want to say is, in more than 3 decades of teaching, I had never taught a course on anti-Semitism. And like Michael Brenner, I really do like teaching courses that are really far from my own areas of research. So I had taught a course on the history of the Holocaust. I've offered that for many years. And I always would start that with a long history of anti-Judaism and the development of racial anti-Semitism, but I'd never just taught on anti-Semitism. And then now, as you can see, and and you're hearing, not only at American University do we have 2 courses on anti-Semitism this semester, but also both Britt Tevis and Paola Tartakoff have developed new courses on the topic as well. And I think it affirms something that one of my former deans once said, which is that the curriculum is the autobiography of the faculty. And I don't think she was far off the mark. So my course is titled Anti-Semitism Enduring Hatred. It is part of our Complex Problems Freshman Seminars at American University. So if you look at the syllabus, those of you at AJS will be able to see them through January 3rd. If you look at the syllabus, you will see that it has a very particular structure and a lot of particular language that relates to our freshman seminars. And our freshman seminars have to be interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. So to me, that meant first that I used a wide variety of sources and a wide variety of ways of getting into the subject. So we read sacred literature, history, primary sources, journalism, fiction, poetry, opinion pieces, contemporary nonfiction. We viewed museum exhibitions. We watched documentaries and feature films and video oral histories, and we listened to podcasts and TED Talks and guest lectures. And that was very deliberate. And in terms of the teaching of the classes, I would always be sure to highlight what the nature of the source was that we were discussing. For my class, I divided it into several really large blocks. The first asked, much as Paola Tartakoff had asked, it asked, what is anti-Semitism? And we discussed definitions and spelling and a taxonomy of anti-Semites and the work anti-Semitism performs in societies. The second large block I called from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism. And we read about Christian origins, we read about anti-Judaism in Western Christendom, the development of racial anti-Semitism, the pogroms, the Dreyfus Affair, and I included 2 classes dealing with Nazi race laws and propaganda and Holocaust testimonies. And I should tell you that the first time I taught the course, I skipped the Holocaust because I figured everybody knew all about it. And of course, especially in this freshman seminar where I would say maybe a third of the students were Jewish. And I had 3 students in China who were 12 hours ahead because we were virtual, and 2 students in California who were 3 hours behind us. I was discovering that they didn't really know a lot about the Holocaust. So this time I added those topics, cut out others, and of course discussed Holocaust denial as I had done last time. But because I'm an American Jewish historian, the last unit asked, is America different? And it answers that it's not. And we focused on America. I took a bunch of different examples to focus on America as a Christian nation, and then to talk about some episodes of anti-Semitism in American history. And the first time I did this course, I really thought about that was going to be kind of the biggest part of the class. I had especially been in conversation with Britt Tevis, and she was doing a lot on American history in her class. And then I realized for my students that didn't work as well for the freshmen, so I kind of moved away from that. And what I want to say in terms of what I learned in the class, I first of all, I'm really glad I took on the challenge of developing a new course on such a difficult subject. And I also, that course affirmed what that dean told me, that I was teaching a subject that unfortunately has reemerged in our time as a new chapter in our collective autobiographies, and that has emerged in our collective curricula. So I'll turn it over to Britt.
Hi. First, I just want to reiterate my thanks for Dr. Nadell for arranging this panel and inviting me to participate. And also thank you to Dr. Kobrin for chairing it, and Dr. Tartakoff and Dr. Brenner for including me. Last spring, I taught a class titled Anti-Semitism in U.S. History at Yale as a part of a postdoctoral fellowship in the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism. It was a small seminar. There were 11 enrolled students plus 1 who chose to audit the class. Most were juniors, some were seniors, some were sophomores. They were not all Jewish, nor were they all history majors. The class included a fine arts major, a biology major, American studies, political science, and of course, There were some near and dear to my heart, the history majors. And these students really offered a range of reasons for why they took the course. Some said that they wanted to be able to contextualize current events. One said that her childhood best friend was Jewish and she was concerned for her, and that's why she enrolled. And another said that he wanted to understand some of his personal experiences growing up. Because I was teaching the class for the first time, and because anti-Semitism in the United States in the past 3 years has become something of a subject of internal debate among American Jewish historians, and because anti-Semitism is something that I grapple with significantly in my own research, and therefore still something that I'm thinking about and making my mind up about, I designed the course around historiographical questions. I wanted to highlight conflicting streams of thought about the nature, severity, and significance of anti-Semitism in the United States. These questions, these historiographical questions included, like my fellow panelists, we first asked what constitutes anti-Semitism. We also discussed how anti-Jewishness has manifested itself, in what arenas and what historical moments. Is anti-Semitism strictly found in the realm of the social in the United States, as many scholars have claimed for many decades? Or can we look in other settings, such as the legal system and political realm? What are the causes of anti-Semitism in the United States? Economic resentment, economic insecurity, racial animus. Is anti-Semitism unique vis-a-vis anti-Semitism elsewhere? And or is it unique vis-a-vis racism in the United States? Put another way, I tried to illuminate contemporary debates among historians about the subject as a way to structure the course. I tried my very best not to impose my own view about this debate, but to expose students to the debate. And that was really my starting point. As you can see in my syllabus, the first 2 classes, possibly the first 2 weeks, really focus on this larger historiographical debate and historiographical works over the decades. I structured my course beyond the historiography chronologically and thematically, stretching from the colonial period through the modern day. This choice was surely guided by the fact that I'm a US historian who specializes in American Jewish history. I really wanted to cover the span of US history and to reveal continuities and discontinuities and place anti-Semitism in specific places and time. I also wanted to frame anti-Jewish sentiments and legal prohibitions during the colonial era and early America as a part of a broader Jewish emancipation process, a framing I adopted from the work of David Sorkin. It's probably not surprising to learn that my readings on popular culture and anti-Semitism in popular culture on stage and screen and page really resonated with students probably the most, as well as those that historicize the contemporary political issues. Other pieces that were particularly popular concerned anti-Semitism on campus. I think that's probably because it was very relatable to college students. Throughout the semester, my students submitted components of a larger research project, which was due at the end of the class. And I have to say that I was really, truly, wildly impressed with the projects they conceived of and then completed. And just by way of example, at the beginning of the course, we read William Penchak's book, Jews and Gentiles in Early America. And in a chapter in that book, we read about Abigail Franks, who was a member of a very prominent colonial Jewish family. The author claimed that she was largely personally responsible for a lot of the anti-Jewish sentiment in pre-revolutionary New York. And one student found this claim to be quite sexist. And so she, as her end of the year, end of the semester project, found published letters by Franks and wrote a play from her perspective, explaining her actions and explaining how she felt about anti-Jewish sentiment in the colonial era. Another student went and researched the writing of the official JAP handbook, which was published in 1982 and was a play on the publication of the official Preppy handbook. And this student probed the anti-Semitic framing of the conceptualization of women as Japs. And she argued that though the term may have had anti-Semitic origins, it had been reclaimed by Jewish women and thus ought not necessarily be considered a slur. I did not find this project to be entirely convincing, but the method and in which the student went about researching and completing this project was quite incredible. She reached out to the author and interviewed her and discussed her intentions. Just a third example, another student looked into the history of the country club that she and her family belonged to in her home state, after she noticed that the club's website proudly centered the proud history of the club, which she then learned that this history included excluding Jews and African Americans, and she looked into what it meant to be for this club to be proud of this history. So the students really were quite phenomenal, and that was a joyful thing to teach people who are very, very eager to learn and phenomenally smart. Regarding the political aspects of teaching in whatever class I'm in, I try my best to be both open about my opinions and open-minded as well, so that students with alternative opinions feel free to express them. One thing that I found to be actually quite helpful in teaching about anti-Semitism is that in my experience, my opinions about the subject as a historian do not immediately reveal my personal politics in the same way that, say, my opinion about abortion access would reveal my politics. So it seemed very clear to me that students did not know quite where to place me on a political map, which I think was quite helpful.
7 minutes are up. Do you have?
Right. Just to conclude, to reiterate what I think all my fellow historians have said, classes about anti-Semitism, I think, really ought to include at least a historical component, and I think ideally are taught entirely from a historical perspective. This really, to me, is the best and best way to understand anti-Semitism as dynamic and as an evolving phenomenon in our time. Thanks.
Thank you to all the panelists. We're going to do a quick lightning round again, but this is for everyone now in this roundtable to put questions. So the speakers are going to, in the same order, speak about what they felt worked best, what they felt they would skip in the future, or anything else they would want to change about the course. But I'm also going to add in a specific question from the chat of the challenge anyone who taught the history of anti-Semitism from antiquity and how it is embedded in Christian texts, and whether it is more difficult for students of certain backgrounds to confront the anti-Jewish strands in their tradition, and just to speak about how you overcame that challenge. So specifically, what worked best, what worked or didn't work, what you would change, and the specific of reaching out to people from specific backgrounds to confront their traditions. Paola,
Okay, thank you. That is so much to address. I will try to do so quickly. So I had to contend in designing the course assignments with the fact that Rutgers students do not do much reading in my experience. And so I had to be very clear in my own head about what I really wanted them to get out of the assignments and the readings in particular, and help them focus. What was key to the success of the course in that regard were these weekly response papers I mentioned earlier. So before each lecture, students would read a very short excerpt from a primary source. If you look at my syllabus, you'll see it's very light on reading. I was the mama bird who digested and regurgitated the secondary literature for my students. And I really wanted to focus with them on how do we analyze and critically examine primary sources. Where do these ideas come from? Where are they kept within our civilization, and how are they transmitted? And these short response papers, they would write less than 1 page double-spaced before the class in which we would discuss that topic, really helped them focus their reading, read critically, gave them traction for their thoughts, a record of what they were covering in the course. It helped me understand what they hadn't understood or what they thought, which was very helpful, and gave students confidence to participate more in class. So I think we all already know that response papers can be a helpful type of assignment, but this was key to the success of the course and the very high level of student participation, I really feel. In terms of what didn't work well, it's so interesting to me to hear that both Pam and Michael like to teach outside of their research areas, because I found that what I had the hardest trouble teaching was my research area. And it was so much easier when I could say there were 3 causes and 3 consequences, and that's all you need to know. But as soon as it was something, and the example I'm going to give is like the origins of the myth of the medieval moneylender, sort of this, the origins of the imputed affinity of Jews for money. I happen to be reading too much about that, both in terms of primary sources and ongoing research and new publications. I am too aware of how complicated this is, how there's this overlap and gap between reality and myth when it comes to this material. And I'm afraid I confused my students and myself further. I need to rethink this over winter break as I prepare to teach it the next time and present it more clearly. Lastly, in terms of students maybe discovering to their dismay anti-Semitism in their own religious traditions, I think may be part of the question that was asked from the audience. This is absolutely something I'm very sensitive to. It definitely happens with Christian students when we read excerpts from the Gospels, especially the Passion narratives. I try to really emphasize the historical context in which these texts were written and have students understand how it meant one thing to the audience and the initial readers, and then the text takes on a life of its own and means new things in each new generation. And this is not only the case with Christian scripture, but it's the case with Jewish scripture and other texts that move throughout time with cultures. But it is absolutely an issue I'd be happy to talk more about.
Michael?
Yes. So what worked well, I think we were lucky to have this speakers series where Paola, you were there, and David Nuremberg and others whose work our students had actually read. And that, of course, I think both Pam and I did this in different classes. We took advantage, as probably many of you did too, we took advantage of this virtual teaching, remote teaching, by bringing people from not only all across America, all over the world, sometimes in our classrooms. And I think students really appreciated that, because that's something we wouldn't do in normal times, and it worked really well. Another thing that worked well, I think, in the class, one of my assignments was that the students in pairs, it was also a relatively small class. I think we were 18 students in that class here at AU. In Munich, it's always a much bigger lecture class, but we had pairs, and the students gave presentations on a movie they had to select, not a documentary, but a movie which somehow deals with anti-Semitism, or some motives anti-Semitism. It appears in the movie. There were obvious choices, some Holocaust movies like Schindler's List, but there were also very interesting choices. Ferenc Turek's, a Hungarian from 1945, and others. So the choices already were, I could see it was interesting for them. And it worked because they did it always in couples to choose a movie, and then they presented it and we discussed it in class. We took a couple of classes for this, and I think that I would do again. And what would I do different? Well, I think, first of all, I agree with what Paola said. It's always, I always struggle when it's our own area of, where we just think, oh my God, how can I be so superficial and do this in one session? Whereas when it's antiquity, I don't care, because I myself know much less about. So I don't know if I would do it differently, but that's always when I have most my stomach ache, when I teach 1 week on anti-Semitism in Germany in the 19th century, for example. But I think I will have to think how to do it differently, because we can't bring in all these experts again into class. So we'll have to rethink that.
Thank you to both. It's so funny. I completely agree. Whenever I have to teach my own field, especially anything on American Jewish women, I'm like done in 20 minutes. I mean, I just condense it all down. So what worked especially well in my class, and this is also something that I really recommend in terms of Zoom, although I did it when it was in person, it was a particular assignment which actually does appear on my syllabus. I assumed, and correctly, I assumed that anti-Semitism would be in the news, would continue to make news a lot. So I asked all the students in the class to set a news alert and to choose 4 news stories on some aspect of anti-Semitism, and then to give oral reports to the class and submit written reports about them to me. And they were really fascinating. First of all, what was stunning was to see what the students chose. So they were very interested in popular figures in music and sports and the social media who had tweeted anti-Semitic comments or posted anti-Semitic videos on TikTok. And they would, in some cases, they would just follow one figure through 4 different news stories. And I also very carefully had them evaluate what their news sources were and where they sat on the political spectrum as part of, making them informed readers, because remember, these are freshmen. And they were also really attracted to news stories about anti-Semitism on campuses around the country. I had one student who came from the Bay Area, and this was right at the time where Laila Khalid, a convicted terrorist who had attempted to hijack an El Al flight in 1970, had been invited to lecture at San Francisco State University, and it had the lecture was shut down by various media, social platforms, and so she just ended up reporting on that. And it was very close to home because it was where she was from. I had a remarkable presentation, like Britt Tevis. I'm so struck by my students. I had a freshman from Pittsburgh who spoke about 4 news stories on the murders at the Tree of Life Synagogue. And it was clear that she had actually been a participant in some of the events that had happened afterwards. And she was so amazing that next time I teach this course, I've already asked her if she would come and talk to the class. What didn't work, because of the pressure that I got to make sure that I was teaching some fiction, I decided that I would teach The Plot Against America. I happen to love Philip Roth's novels. I think that is his best novel. And it worked pretty well when I did it in the spring. But in the spring, when we were live, the students were also able to go to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum as part of the co-curricular activities for the class and to see its outstanding exhibit on the Americans and the Holocaust. This semester, even though they could see part of that exhibit virtually, it didn't really work well. And I have to be honest, I think there are a couple of students in the class, some of the students who came from outside the US, who were confused at the beginning about whether or not Charles Lindbergh had actually ever become president of the United States. So I decided that, I see Michael nodding, I decided that I'm not going to use that again unless we are actually live in person, where I can take them down to the museum and they can really see what's going on in the 30s and 40s. As far as the question about what happens when students discover anti-Semitism in their own traditions, their religious traditions or the national traditions, this is, as Paola Tartakoff said, this is a very, very tough subject. I will say that I have a long experience highlighting that. For many years, I used to give a many-houred lecture and one day on anti-Judaism, the history of anti-Judaism, that I presented to Catholic school teachers who came to Washington to spend a week learning about the history of the Holocaust. But it was in the era when the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is where they were based, was not allowed to present materials that were about anti-Judaism. They had to really start, they had a kind of mandate to start with racial anti-Semitism. So I've seen what it's like when people who are very devoted to their faiths discover very, very painfully traditions about anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism in their own beliefs. And like Paola, I don't have a good answer to how to deal with it. I just try to be as sensitive as I possibly can. I'll turn it over to Britt Tevis.
Concerning my greatest successes in the class, I really, again, think the success of the class is really the students' own involvement and participation. So I don't take personal credit for that. It's much easier to identify what I would change and do differently going forward. And there are at least 3 changes that I would make to my syllabus. And I would make these changes, particularly if I weren't teaching this class in a seminar setting. And one is that the historiography that I assigned at the beginning, it was just overwhelming and too much. And I only needed really 2 examples of what I wanted the students to take, which was that the moment that they're living through is a moment in which the field itself is undergoing this major transformation from a field that has traditionally and historically understood anti-Semitism in the United States as something that has not been a genuine problem and not necessarily worth too much study, to actually rethinking that. And so if I were to do it all again, going forward, I think I would, number one, definitely keep Tony Michael's article on exceptionalism. I think that's probably the most important historiographical work on anti-Semitism that the field has seen, in at least the past 2 or 3 decades. I also would keep David Sorkin's article about exceptionalism and understanding American anti-Semitism in the context of European anti-Semitism. And I would probably assign one of John Hyam's articles because he has just had such an outsized, and I find to be problematic, influence on the field and the study of anti-Semitism in the United States. The other historiographical works are very important if you're going to become, a hyper specialist in anti-Semitism in the United States, but I don't think if you're taking a seminar as a college student is necessary to do all that extra reading. The other shifts I would make is that so too much reading, and I also made the mistake of not understanding just how much younger my students were than I am. Because quarantine and COVID lockdown happened in the middle of the semester, I had to change some of the second half of the course because students didn't have access to their books. And so we needed some new materials. And so we had one class that was about anti-Semitism and comedy. And I sent out a clip from a Borat movie, and my students had no idea who he was. And I sent it out without context, thinking everyone, knows Sacha Baron Cohen. And it turns out that's not true. And I had a few students who were genuinely just so horrified and couldn't understand why I sent out a man singing a song called "Throw the Jew Down the Well." And I felt really bad about that. So I would remember that there's an age gap, and I need to pick maybe some examples or explain them before sending them out.
So I thank you. Does anyone from the audience have questions? Because the chat is empty. And if not, this is your chance. I want just each speaker just to speak for like another minute or two of a final note of what they would say they think this course should take in the future. I mean, I will just say, I teach, it's called The Holocaust and Genocide in American Culture. It is an intellectual history that thinks about why there's a Holocaust museum in Washington, D.C. before there was one for the history of African Americans. And the second time I taught it, half my students were indigenous. They thought it was about them. It was amazing. It was the most amazing course. So I changed midway what we were discussing. We threw out Hannah Arendt, and we talked about thinking about why certain Holocausts and genocides are spoken about in American culture and others are not, and what that means. So it was recreating a whole new syllabus. So I just think it was very interesting thinking about that question about Christian students confronting their anti-Jewish strands. This was about Americans. Everyone was American, and thinking about why genocide is never used when thinking about American conquest. It was an amazing. So I leave it at that. But I would love the speakers just to say, and we have one last about teaching anti-Semitism and about this issue of exceptionalism. And the other question you can say besides that is, would the keywords books, the one on anti-Semitism, why no one would use that, or did someone use it, or what do they think is the pros and cons? So everyone has one last 2 minutes to speak, and then we're going to go into the schmooze. So if people have direct questions for speakers, it will happen. You can ask that way. So Paola, you are first.
Sure, thank you. What's the exceptionalism question?
if you want to reflect on exceptionalism. Oh, we'll put it in the chat, the title and the author about exceptionalism. But this whole issue, I think, about, I mean, the way that anti-Semitism has been taught by, it seems, everyone here as being something about hatred of Jews, and in somewhat, it's not about hatred of other groups, right? And thinking about exceptionalism, how it really does apply maybe across, not just when thinking about the United States, and how we think about and conceptualize and narrate anti-Semitism, right?
So something, I think this is related to what you're speaking about. Something I was not able to talk about enough and work through enough and incorporate sufficiently into the course as I had hoped was the relationship between anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred and bigotry, and how often in history when Jews are being targeted or persecuted or scapegoated or treated badly or spoken ill of, other groups are too. And I would love to find and make a space to explore those relationships in different historical contexts. And it's something that I hope to do more of. Something that I tell students, but I need to think more about, I need to also learn more about other forms of hatred and bigotry, is that something characteristic of anti-Semitism is that its tropes are very malleable and protean and often contradict one another, yet they continue to evolve and resurface and be tapped into and put to new uses. And I'd like to explore to what extent that is or isn't unique to anti-Semitism, and to the extent that it is that just because of how long there has been anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism, and so it has had to endure and evolve in those ways. I'll just say on one foot about concluding my remarks that I had really braced myself in light of the size and diversity of my class for a lot more pushback from students from all sorts of political views and positions. And I thought there would be a lot more heated debate in class and disagreement among students, but I was so delighted, and I am filled with hope for the future of our society after having taught this course one time. As Pam and Britt have said as well, I was amazed by my students' curiosity, goodwill, and ability to sort of reach across superficial differences between them. And I'm really energized to teach this course again in the spring, starting in a few weeks, because it has really filled me with hope for our future. So was daunted to take this on, but so glad that I did. And I look forward to continuing.
Let me also say something about the comparative perspective. I think that I would probably enlarge. I ended my class with having them read Ghetto and Emancipation by Salo Baron and discuss the Lacrimose version of Jewish history. And I think I would, and then that was really great because, I mean, in terms of their reactions, because they by then had already gone through a whole semester where we talked about how, about anti-Semitism and about Jewish suffering. And then we asked again this kind of comparative perspective, especially in, of course, his essay about the Middle Ages. I think I would start out with something like that and then end the semester with it and see how different their perspective, how it has changed. But I think definitely these sessions about, the Lacrimose version of Jewish history, or when we discussed anti-Semitism and racism in today's America, or anti-Zionism, anti-Israel, and anti-Semitism, all of those comparatives, I think, work pretty well to see, well, the whole class is about anti-Semitism, but Jewish history is not all about suffering, and not all suffering is about the Jews.
Okay.
So the first thing I would say is I actually included a reading from Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning at the very beginning of the class to locate anti-Semitism as a form of racism and to raise the issue of that there are multiple expressions of racism. And I didn't get to do as much as I wanted in the class with that, to talk about other forms. But as Michael said, we did have also a panel anti-Semitism and racism. So it came up a couple of times in the class. And then another way that I brought it into the class was one of the documentaries the students watched was From Swastika to Jim Crow, which is, I think, a problematic documentary, but at least was a way for me to get these issues into the class in a couple of different occasions. So that's, I think, one way in which I was able to raise this. I actually had a question from my colleagues. I don't know if this happened, and maybe it was because some of my students were from other cultures, but there were a couple of times in the class, especially in the journals that the students wrote. My students, like Paola's students, had to write journal reflections on their readings, which is the only way to make sure they actually do the readings, and they were instrumental in the success of the class. But a couple of times they wrote things that are anti-Semitic tropes. I mean, I heard, that the Jews are very good with money, and they meant it. They didn't mean it as anti-Semitic, and it was very hard, especially because of language barriers, very hard to figure out what to do with that. So I don't know if I was the only one who encountered that, but if other people did, I would really benefit from your remarks on that.
I just want to just underline Paola's statement about hope. That was actually my largest takeaway from teaching this course. And it was just such a relief, particularly in the context of these wider political events and even today, to think about this. I think about these students a lot because I felt so hopeful after having teaching this class and being in a classroom with them. And I felt a sense of relief, like, okay, this generation of students is so incredibly thoughtful. Yeah, that just brought me tremendous personal relief. And so that was teach anti-Semitism, and you too maybe can feel so hopeful. It really truly is wonderful. As far as focusing on comparisons and as a part of trying to challenge ideas about American Jewish exceptionalism, something that I tried to do in my syllabus, I too would like to do a better job of it, but something I did try to do was to include comparative readings. So for example, where we talked about Jewish students being excluded from fraternities and sororities, we also looked at that happening, exclusion against Black students. When we read about housing covenants, we also learned about how housing covenants and redlining harmed African-American communities, public accommodations, et cetera, et cetera. So where anytime I could draw or point out or spotlight similarities, I used to tell my students, like, when we're thinking about these similarities, I don't think white supremacists are like that creative. They're not that creative. So if they develop a tool to discriminate against one group, I think often are like, who else can we deploy this against? And so I think that's one way to wrap our head around these similarities. In doing that, I would say that one challenge I faced, and something that I'm still grappling with personally, is it's very important to me to avoid trying to say the Jewish experience was, just like the African-American experience or any gradation of that sort of sentiment. Because that's just not true. And I think students have a lot of fear about trying to, appearing in any way to denigrate or not acknowledge the African-American experience. And so there was a tension there in trying to both understand anti-Semitism, but also not somehow negate or diminish the severity of anti-Black racism. And so that was an interesting tension that we held throughout the class. This did not answer Pamela's question, but it's just something I wanted to add to the conversation.
So I think there are more questions. One deals with gender and another one deals with understanding Jewish responses to anti-Semitism. But I do want to go into the schmooze part. Amy, or will you help us do that so that if people have questions for any of our roundtable panelists, they can ask them directly?
Sure, I'm changing that now. Should be updated.
And people should go and schmooze. as my moderation is officially over and you can ask direct questions.
And I am taking off the spotlights as well.
Okay,
So
great.
we can
And
see
thank
everybody.
you everyone for coming. And again, I put in the chat the link to the syllabi if you want for future reference. They'll be up for until January 3rd, correct? They'll be up through.
Yes.
And thank you again to all the panelists for your thoughtful presentations, hopeful presentations. And I look forward to the conversation continuing.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Do we have